My name is Jonathan Hale. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my life I've been described with words like stable, easygoing, or low maintenance. I've never been the loud one in the room. I don't dominate conversations, and I don't rush to defend myself when I'm misunderstood. I work steadily, I plan carefully, and I've always believed that if you stay reasonable long enough, things eventually balance out. That belief shaped how people saw me, especially my parents. To them, I was the dependable one. The child who didn't cause trouble, the one who could handle things. When something went wrong, it was assumed I'd adapt. When money was tight, it was assumed I'd understand. When decisions were made without my input, it was assumed I wouldn't mind. I didn't fight those assumptions, partly because I didn't know how, and partly because I thought being trusted meant being valued. From the outside, my life looked calm. No scandals, no dramatic family conflicts, just a grown adult still connected to his parents, still involved, still trying to do the right thing. What people didn't see was how quietly that role narrowed over time, how being reasonable slowly turned into being optional. This story begins with an argument about money, not a dramatic one. No screaming, no slammed doors, just a conversation that went wrong in the way small conversations often do, through tone, implication, and unspoken expectations. At the time, I thought it would pass like all the others. I was wrong, because shortly after that argument, something happened that still feels unreal when I say it out loud. My parents locked me out of the house. Not symbolically, not emotionally, physically. The home I thought I still belonged to disappeared overnight. What you're about to hear isn't a revenge story. There's no payoff where someone gets humiliated or exposed. I'm not here to paint my parents as monsters or myself as a victim. What I want to do is walk you through how something like this happens quietly, how families can cross irreversible lines without ever raising their voices. This is a story about roles we inherit without agreeing to them, about silence that gets mistaken for consent, about how people can rely on your strength while slowly denying your place, and about what happens when you stop reacting emotionally and start paying attention structurally. Over the next hour, I'll take you through the moments that mattered, most of which didn't feel important when they happened. You'll hear about the patterns I ignored, the ones I documented, and the ones I finally understood too late to undo. You'll hear how preparation doesn't always look like resistance, and how calm decisions can carry more weight than confrontation ever could. I'm telling this now because I've learned that losing a home isn't always about losing a building. Sometimes it's about realizing that your place was conditional all along, and that the condition was your silence. So before we go any further, let me ask you something, honestly and gently. Have you ever tried so hard to keep the peace that you didn't notice when you were the one being pushed out of it? For most of my life, I was defined less by who I was and more by how useful I was to the people around me, especially my parents. Not in an obvious way. No one ever said, "You're only valuable if you help." It was subtler than that. It lived in expectations that were never spoken out loud, only repeated until they felt normal. To them, I was the easy child. I didn't need much. I didn't ask for money once I started working. I didn't push back when plans changed at the last minute. I didn't challenge decisions that affected me directly. If something needed fixing, paperwork, logistics, technology, budgeting, I handled it. Quietly, efficiently, without being asked twice. At family gatherings, my role was predictable. I'd be the one helping in the background while conversations happened without me. If there was tension, I was expected to smooth it over. If there was a problem, I was expected to understand both sides. I was praised for being mature, which I later realized was code for low resistance. And I wore that identity proudly for a long time, because when you're the one who doesn't cause trouble, people trust you. They rely on you. They stop worrying about you. What I didn't realize was that being worry-free to others often means being invisible to them. My parents saw me as stable, predictable, someone who would land on his feet no matter what. They talked about my siblings' futures with concern and urgency. When it came to me, the assumption was always the same. Jonathan will be fine. That phrase followed me everywhere. When I stayed longer than planned at home to save money, it was framed as practical, for everyone. When I contributed financially, it was treated as a natural extension of my presence, not a sacrifice. When decisions were made about the house, about finances, about timelines, I was informed afterward, never consulted beforehand, and I accepted that. because I believed my value came from being reasonable. What I didn't see then was how that role slowly narrowed my place in the family. I wasn't a stakeholder. I was a support beam. Important but replaceable. Necessary but not visible unless something broke. There were moments that should have stood out. Small comments. Offhand jokes about how I didn't really need much space. Casual remarks about how I could always figure something out if circumstances changed. At the time, I laughed them off. I told myself they were compliments. But invisibility has a sound. It's quiet, but consistent. It sounds like decisions are being made without you because you won't mind. It sounds like expectations are increasing while appreciation stays flat. It sounds like your needs are being postponed indefinitely because someone else's are louder. I never felt abused. That's important to say. There was no shouting, no cruelty. That's why it took so long for me to understand what was happening. Everything was wrapped in the language of family, practicality, and shared responsibility. And because I wasn't suffering loudly, no one noticed I was being slowly edged out of relevance. I remember once overhearing my parents talk about future plans for the house. Renovations, selling possibilities, downsizing. My name never came up. Not once. It wasn't malicious. It was worse than that. It was assumed I would adjust. That was the pattern. I adjusted. I adjusted my expectations, my timelines, my sense of security. I told myself that flexibility was strength, that loyalty meant endurance, that staying quiet was a form of love. But what I didn't realize was that every time I adjusted, the space meant for me shrank just a little more. By the time the argument about money happened, the one that would later justify locking me out, I had already been slowly repositioned in my own family narrative. I was no longer a son with a place. I was a variable, a convenience, a presence that could be removed if it complicated the equation. And the most unsettling part? No one thought they were doing anything wrong. Because when people are used to you being invisible, your absence doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like a solution. The first moment something truly shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no raised voice, no clear boundary crossed that I could point to later and say, that was it. It arrived quietly, disguised as practicality, and that's why everyone else missed it, including me. It happened during a routine conversation about household expenses. Nothing dramatic, just numbers, timing, and tone. My parents were talking about upcoming costs, repairs, insurance adjustments, unexpected fees. I listened, the way I always did, already preparing in my head how I could help smooth things over. At one point, I asked a simple question, not confrontational, not defensive. I asked how long they expected the arrangement to continue. The unspoken understanding that I would contribute more than my share because I was able to. The room went quiet. Not tense, just paused. My mother responded first. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She said something like, "You're overthinking it. We'll handle it when we get there." My father nodded, adding that this was just how families work, that everyone pitches in when needed. What struck me wasn't what they said, it was what they didn't. They didn't ask what I was planning. They didn't ask what I needed. They didn't acknowledge that I was asking about my future, not just theirs. Instead, the conversation subtly repositioned me. I was no longer someone participating in a shared plan. I was someone expected to remain flexible indefinitely. I remember feeling a small internal resistance rise up, barely noticeable, like pressure behind the eyes. But I ignored it. I told myself this wasn't worth making awkward, that I was being dramatic, that clarity would come later. That was the first small cut, because something changed after that conversation. Not externally. Externally, everything stayed the same. But internally, I started noticing how often my questions were deflected rather than answered. When I asked about timelines, I was told not to worry. When I asked about boundaries, I was told to relax. When I asked about fairness, I was told I was being too analytical. No one said I was wrong. They just treated my concerns as unnecessary. And that's how dismissal often works. It doesn't contradict you. It minimizes you. I noticed that my contributions were now discussed as expected, not appreciated. There was no gratitude attached, only an assumption. If I ever hesitated, even briefly, the tone shifted, not angry, disappointed, as if I had failed to live up to a role I never formally agreed to. I watched my parents discuss finances with each other using language that implied ownership and authority. When it came to me, the language shifted to obligation. I wasn't consulted as a partner, I was managed as a resource. Still, I said nothing, because the cut was small. Small enough to rationalize, small enough to ignore. Small enough that if I mentioned it, I would have sounded petty. And everyone else did ignore it. My siblings didn't notice. Friends wouldn't have understood. From the outside, it looked like cooperation, family teamwork, responsibility. But I remembered it. I remembered the way my question was brushed aside. I remembered the smile that closed the conversation instead of opening it. I remembered how quickly my role snapped back into place the moment I tried to define it. That moment taught me something important, even though I didn't fully understand it yet. In my family, clarity was only welcome when it benefited someone else. When it came from me, it was treated as a disruption. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me cautious, because once you see how easily your voice can be softened out of a room, you start listening more carefully to everything that follows. And from that point on, the pattern didn't stop. It repeated. After that first small cut, nothing happened. And that was the problem. Life continued exactly as before, which made it easy to tell myself that I had imagined the shift. There were no consequences, no follow-up conversations, no visible changes in behavior. And because nothing exploded, I assumed nothing was wrong. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as a decision, it arrives as repetition. The same patterns kept playing out, only now I noticed them more. Not sharply, not emotionally, just quietly, like someone who started paying attention to background noise they used to tune out. Conversations about money kept happening without me in the room. I would find out afterward, usually in passing. Oh, we decided to move some things around. Or, we already figured it out. The language was always vague, always final. Decisions had been made. My role was to adapt. If I offered input, it was acknowledged politely and then ignored. If I raised concerns, they were met with reassurance instead of answers. You worry too much. It's not that serious. Why are you making this complicated? Those phrases did something subtle to me. They trained me to doubt my own instincts. I started filtering my thoughts before I spoke. I'd ask myself whether a concern was important enough to mention, knowing that the bar for important kept moving. Eventually, most things didn't make it past that internal filter. That was the normalization. What made it harder to recognize was that my parents weren't hostile. They were calm, practical, even kind in their own way. They just operated on the assumption that my flexibility was unlimited, and I helped reinforce that assumption. I kept contributing financially without renegotiating terms. I kept adjusting my plans to fit theirs. I kept telling myself that this was temporary, even as months turned into years. I told myself that family arrangements don't need contracts, that trust fills the gaps. But trust without clarity doesn't stay neutral, it tilts. I noticed how my presence in the house became more conditional. Not officially, nothing was said, but in tone, in implication, in the way requests were framed. Less like, would you mind, and more like, you can handle this, right? And every time I did handle it, the expectation solidified. I wasn't thanked anymore, I was counted on. There's a difference. Being thanked acknowledges choice. Being counted on assumes compliance. I normalized that shift by telling myself it was maturity. That this was what adulthood looked like, carrying more weight without needing recognition. I even felt a quiet pride in it. While others complained about their families, I told myself I was above that, more grounded, more reliable. What I didn't realize was that pride was doing the work silence should never do, protecting other people from having to reflect. The more I absorbed, the less anyone else had to adjust. I started noticing that my discomfort only existed internally. Externally, everything was smooth. Which meant, if I ever decided to speak up, it would look sudden, unreasonable, out of character. That realization scared me more than the disrespect itself, because when you've trained people to expect silence from you, your voice feels like a breach of contract. So I stayed quiet. I rationalized it by telling myself that no one was intentionally dismissing me. That intent mattered more than impact. That as long as there was no malice, there was no real harm. But harm doesn't need malice. It only needs momentum. And momentum was building. Each dismissed question made the next one harder to ask. Each unacknowledged contribution made the next one easier to assume. Each time I swallowed my discomfort, the line moved slightly, just enough that I didn't notice how far I'd drifted from having a defined place. By the time I realized something was wrong, it no longer felt like a single issue I could point to. It felt like the water I was standing in had risen slowly, quietly, until I was chest deep and pretending not to notice. That's the danger of normalizing disrespect. It doesn't feel like being pushed. It feels like choosing not to stand up. It took me a long time to understand that what was happening wasn't accidental, not malicious, but not random either. Roles don't just appear in families, they're assigned, reinforced, and protected, and mine had become very clear. I was the reliable one, not the decision maker, not the priority. The reliable one, the person who absorbs pressure so others don't have to feel it. The one who fills gaps without asking why the gap exists in the first place. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction seemed to orbit that expectation. If something needed organizing, it drifted toward me. If money needed covering temporarily, it was assumed I'd manage. If a problem arose, I was brought in late, only after the direction had already been chosen. I wasn't invited into discussions, I was invited to the execution, and the more efficiently I performed that role, the more permanent it became. What hurt wasn't the work itself. I'm capable. I don't mind responsibility. What hurt was realizing that my reliability had quietly disqualified me from being considered. People don't consult the wall that holds the house up. They just expect it to stay standing. I noticed how differently my parents spoke to me compared to others. With my siblings, there was concern, negotiation, and reassurance. With me, there was an assumption, a subtle belief that I didn't need to be asked because I wouldn't say no. And to be fair, I rarely did. Part of that was conditioning. Part of it was fear. Fear that if I disrupted the role, I'd disrupt my place entirely. Because when your value is tied to function, you start to wonder what happens when you stop functioning. So I stayed within the lines. I stopped bringing up long-term plans. I stopped asking about ownership, timelines, or exit strategies. I told myself that clarity could wait until things were less busy, even though they never were. Instead, I focused on being useful, on being steady, on being the person who made life easier for everyone else. That was my assigned role. And what I didn't fully understand yet was that roles like that come with an expiration date, but no warning label. The house we lived in became a symbol of that dynamic. It was spoken about as theirs, their mortgage, their asset, their decisions. My presence in it was framed as temporary, even as years passed. Temporary became indefinite. Indefinite became assumed. I wasn't building equity. I wasn't building security. I was maintaining equilibrium. And equilibrium only matters to the people who benefit from it. The clearest sign of my role came one evening when plans were discussed casually over dinner. My parents talked about future possibilities, downsizing, selling, relocating. They spoke as if I were a background detail, not someone whose life would be directly affected. I realized then that in their mental model, I wasn't part of the future picture. I was part of the present utility. That realization didn't spark anger, it sparked awareness. I understood something important in that moment. If circumstances changed, my position wouldn't be defended, it would be adjusted, because reliable people are adaptable by design. That's the unspoken trade-off. You get trust, but you lose protection. You get responsibility, but not authority. You're praised for stability, but excluded from permanence. Once I saw the role clearly, I had a choice. I could confront it directly, demand recognition, renegotiate terms, risk being seen as difficult. Or I could observe it fully, understand its mechanics, and decide my next move without emotion. I chose the second option, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to know exactly how far the role extended before I stepped outside it. And that required patience. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no confrontation, no announcement, no dramatic realization that changed everything in an instant. In fact, if you had been watching from across the room, you would have seen nothing more than an ordinary moment in an ordinary day. That's what made it so decisive. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, early in the morning, before anyone else was awake. The house was quiet in that specific way that only exists before routines begin. No television, no footsteps. No background noise to blur your thoughts. I had my notebook open in front of me, the one I used to track expenses, deadlines, and reminders. Numbers, mostly. Dates. Commitments. At first, I was doing what I always did. Reviewing what needed to be handled next. Bills that weren't technically mine. Repairs I had already researched. Adjustments I had quietly absorbed without discussion. It was familiar, almost comforting. Then I noticed something. Not a mistake, not a discrepancy, a pattern. I saw how many decisions I was preparing for that I had no authority over. How much responsibility I carried without any corresponding control. How every line item in that notebook represented time, energy, money moving in one direction, away from me. And for the first time, I didn't rationalize it. I didn't tell myself it was temporary. I didn't excuse it as family dynamics. I didn't minimize it by comparing myself to people who had it worse. I just let the reality sit there. That was the shift. It wasn't emotional. It was structural. I realized that I had been living inside a system that was stable for everyone except the person holding it together. And systems like that don't collapse suddenly. They shed the parts that aren't protected. I thought about the argument about money that had happened weeks earlier. How calm it had been. How quickly my concerns were neutralized. How little weight my future carried in the conversation. At the time, I'd told myself it was nothing. Now I understood it wasn't anything. It was a signal, not of hostility, but of hierarchy. I wasn't angry at my parents. If anything, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. Clarity does that. It removes the need for emotional escalation because it replaces confusion with information. I saw my role clearly now, not as something personal, but as something functional. And once you see a role that way, you stop identifying with it. That morning, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't confront anyone yet. I wouldn't announce boundaries or demand changes, not because I didn't deserve them, but because I needed to understand the full shape of the situation before I altered it. Silence, I realized, didn't have to mean endurance. It could mean observation. From that point on, I started paying attention differently. Not to tone or intention, but to outcomes. Not to what was said, but to what consistently happened afterward. I watched how decisions flowed, who benefited, who adjusted, and every observation confirmed what I had seen at that table. I wasn't positioned for continuity, I was positioned for convenience. That realization didn't hurt the way betrayal does. It steadied me. It told me that if something irreversible happened later, if a door closed, literally or otherwise, it wouldn't be sudden. It would be the logical conclusion of a system I had finally chosen to see. That was the day something shifted. Nothing changed on the outside. But inside, I stopped waiting for fairness to appear on its own. After that morning, my silence changed quality. Before, it had been reflexive. A habit shaped by years of smoothing things over, of not wanting to be the source of discomfort. Now, it was intentional, measured, chosen. I didn't withdraw. I didn't become cold or distant. If anything, I became more composed. I continued doing what I had always done on the surface, but internally, I stopped volunteering pieces of myself that weren't protected. That distinction mattered. I listened more than I spoke. When plans were discussed around me, I noted what was assumed rather than what was agreed upon. When money came up, I tracked patterns instead of reacting to tone. I started documenting things privately, not out of suspicion, but out of respect for reality. Because reality, I had learned, doesn't argue, it just accumulates. My parents mistook my continued calm for compliance. They spoke more freely around me, assuming I wasn't paying attention because I wasn't challenging them. They filled silences with assumptions, and in doing so, revealed more than they realized. I heard how casually my presence in the house was framed as flexible. How often were phrases like "for now" and "until later" used without any intention of defining later. I noticed how decisions with long-term consequences were discussed as if my role would remain static, no matter what changed. They weren't trying to hide anything. They just didn't think they needed to. That's what silence invites when people are used to it. It invites projection. And while they projected stability and endurance onto me, I quietly withdrew my emotional investment from those assumptions. I stopped correcting misunderstandings that benefited others. I stopped preemptively solving problems that weren't mine to own. Instead, I observed what happened when I paused. Small things surfaced immediately. Delays, confusion, minor inconveniences that had previously been absorbed without notice. No one connected those moments to me directly, but the system felt them. Still, no one addressed it. Because silence is often mistaken for weakness, especially when it's paired with consistency. People assume that if you don't protest, you don't mind. That if you're calm, you're unaffected. That if you stay, you're consenting to everything that comes with staying. They were wrong. I wasn't consenting anymore. I was evaluating. I paid attention to how easily my parents talked about change when they believed I would adapt. How certain they were that I wouldn't disrupt their plans. That certainty became the most valuable information I had, because it told me exactly how unprotected my position was, and that knowledge shifted my internal posture completely. I stopped hoping for acknowledgement. Hope keeps you waiting. I started preparing for independence, not in a dramatic way, but in a deliberate one. I adjusted my finances quietly. I reviewed documents. I clarified what was mine and what wasn't. I noted what access I had and how easily it could be revoked. I didn't confront the possibility of being locked out emotionally. I confronted it logistically. My parents saw none of this. They saw the same calm presence, the same reliability, the same silence. They took it as confirmation that nothing had changed. But silence, when chosen consciously, is no longer surrender. It's positioning. And while they believed they were moving forward with certainty, I was doing something far more important. I was making sure that when the assumptions finally broke, I wouldn't be the one scrambling to understand why. The most revealing thing about that period wasn't what changed, it was what didn't. No one asked why I had become quieter in a different way. No one checked in to see if I was still comfortable with the arrangement. No one noticed that I had stopped offering solutions before problems fully formed, because from their perspective, nothing was wrong. That's what happens when people are used to your stability. They don't monitor it. They assume it's permanent, like gravity. What they never noticed was how methodical I became. I began treating my life the way I treated complex work projects, separating emotion from structure. I listed what I controlled, what I contributed, and what I merely had access to. I stopped blurring those lines in my head because blurred lines are where people get trapped. I reviewed every financial interaction I was part of, not just amounts, but context. What was framed as help? What was framed as temporary? What was never acknowledged at all? I didn't keep these notes out of resentment. I kept them because memory gets unreliable when pressure arrives. Documentation doesn't. I paid attention to language. The way we slowly turned into you. The way our situation became what you can handle. I noticed how often decisions were justified by convenience rather than fairness. And the most important thing I noticed, there was no contingency plan for me. In all the conversations about the future, downsizing, selling, reorganizing, there was never a moment where someone asked, "What happens to Jonathan?" Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't think they needed to. They assumed I would figure it out. That assumption is comfortable for the people making it, and dangerous for the person living under it. So I began building my own contingencies, quietly. I verified what legal ties I actually had to the house. The answer was simple and unsettling. None. No lease. No formal agreement. Just trust, history, and expectation. Things that dissolve quickly when circumstances change. I made sure my finances were clean and separate. No shared obligations I didn't understand. No dependencies I couldn't exit. I stopped anchoring my plans to verbal assurances and started anchoring them to what was enforceable. I also began detaching emotionally in a very specific way. I didn't withdraw affection, I withdrew the assumption. I stopped assuming that being family meant permanence. I stopped assuming that a contribution guaranteed consideration. I stopped assuming that staying quiet was keeping me safe. That internal shift gave me clarity I'd never had before. I realized that the people around me weren't cruel. They were comfortable. And comfort dulls accountability faster than hostility ever could. They never noticed the nights I spent mapping exit timelines. They never noticed the way I stopped integrating my future into theirs. They never noticed that I'd started preparing for a life where access could be revoked without warning. Because preparation doesn't announce itself. It looks calm. It looks like routine. It looks like someone who isn't causing trouble. And that's the irony. The very traits that made me invisible before now made my preparation invisible too. By the time anything changed externally, I was already standing somewhere else internally. And they had no idea. The reveal didn't come as a shock. That surprised me the most. I had always assumed that if I ever discovered something truly decisive, something that changed how I understood my position, it would land with force, anger, relief, a rush of emotion that demanded action. Instead, it arrived quietly, like confirmation of something I already knew but hadn't fully articulated. It happened late one evening, alone again, going through documents I had gradually gathered over time. Bank statements. Old emails, property records, nothing secret, nothing hidden. Just information that had always been accessible but never assembled in one place. When I finally saw the full picture, it was undeniable. I had no standing, not legally, not financially, not structurally. The house I lived in, the place I had helped maintain, contribute to, and stabilize, was never meant to include me beyond convenience. There was no clause, no understanding, no fallback. If circumstances changed, my access could end instantly, and no rule would be broken. That was the private reveal. Not that my parents could remove me, but that the system had been designed in a way where doing so would be effortless. No discussion required, no justification needed. Just a lock and a belief that I'd figure it out. What struck me wasn't fear. It was cause and clarity. I finally understood why my questions had always been softened away. Why were vague? Why were they never formalized? Ambiguity wasn't accidental, it was functional. It preserved flexibility for them while placing all the risk on me. And once I saw that, there was no room left for denial. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't feel betrayed in the dramatic sense. Betrayal implies a broken promise. This was worse and simpler. There had never been a promise to break, just assumptions. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. Not spiraling, not rehearsing conversations, just letting the structure settle into place in my mind. This was the leverage I had discovered, not over them, but over myself. I now knew exactly what staying meant, and exactly what leaving would require. There was no illusion left to protect. That night, I closed the folder, put the documents away, and did something that surprised even me. I slept well, because uncertainty had been replaced with definition. And definition, even when it's uncomfortable, is easier to move with than hope. From that moment on, my actions stopped being reactive entirely. They became deliberate. I didn't need confrontation to validate what I knew. I didn't need acknowledgement to confirm my worth. I had what I needed, a clear understanding of the terrain. And once you understand the terrain, the only real question left is when to move, not if. Knowing the truth didn't force an immediate choice. That's something people rarely talk about. Clarity doesn't always demand action right away. Sometimes it just removes the excuses for delay. After the private reveal, I found myself standing at a quiet crossroads. There were multiple paths available to me, and none of them were dramatic. That was what made the decision difficult. Each option came with a different kind of cost. I could stay. Staying meant continuing as I was. Useful, adaptable, unprotected. It meant accepting that my place in the house existed only as long as it was convenient. It meant betting my stability on the assumption that circumstances wouldn't change suddenly. That option required no confrontation, no disruption, just endurance. I could confront. I could sit my parents down and lay everything out. My concerns, my contributions, the imbalance I had finally named. I could ask for clarity, for boundaries, for something formal. That path carried the possibility of improvement. It also carried risk, because confrontation would force them to see me differently. And once people are used to you being easy, they often experience boundaries as betrayal. If the conversation went poorly, I could accelerate the very outcome I was trying to avoid, without being prepared for it. Or I could exit, not abruptly, not emotionally, but intentionally, on my own timeline, with my own structure in place. That option meant accepting the reality of my position without trying to renegotiate it. It meant choosing self-protection over reconciliation. That was the irreversible path, because once you prepare to leave quietly, you stop investing in outcomes you don't control. You stop trying to be seen inside a system that benefits from not seeing you. For weeks, I didn't decide. I lived inside the tension of knowing all three options were available. I watched how my parents spoke about the future. I paid attention to whether any natural opening for mutual clarity appeared. It didn't. Everything continued under the assumption that I would remain flexible indefinitely. That was the answer. The decision point didn't come with anger or resolve. It came with acceptance. I realized that waiting for someone else to initiate fairness was still a form of dependence. So I chose the path that didn't require permission. I decided to leave, but not yet. First, I would make sure that when the moment came, I wouldn't be forced into chaos. I wouldn't be scrambling for housing, money, or explanation. I would move from a position of quiet stability. The irreversible part wasn't the act of leaving. It was the internal's commitment. Once I made that commitment, I stopped imagining futures that included staying. I stopped planning around shared spaces. I stopped anchoring my identity to a role that was never meant to last. I didn't announce this to anyone. I simply began living as someone who knew his access could end at any time, and acted accordingly. That decision changed everything, even though no one noticed. Once the decision was made, everything became quieter. Not emptier, quieter. There's a difference between waiting and preparing. Waiting keeps you emotionally attached to outcomes you don't control. Preparing removes emotion from the equation entirely. That's the phase I entered. I didn't rush. I didn't announce plans. I didn't give anyone a reason to adjust their behavior around me. On the surface, nothing changed. Internally, every action now had direction. I started with the practical. I reviewed my finances with a different lens, not just affordability, but independence. I made sure every account was solely in my name. I stopped informal transfers and replaced them with clearly documented contributions, knowing that clarity protects both sides, even if only one side appreciates it. I quietly reduced my financial footprint in the house. Not dramatically, not enough to raise concern, just enough that I wasn't extending myself further into something I didn't own. I began researching housing options without urgency, short-term rentals, backup locations, timelines that allowed flexibility without dependence. I didn't commit to anything yet, I just ensured that options existed. Because options change how you carry yourself, I also organized my personal documents. Identification, records, contracts. Everything consolidated and accessible. It wasn't paranoia, it was respect for reality. I had already learned how quickly access could be reframed as privilege. Throughout all of this, my parents remained unaware. They still spoke about plans that assumed my availability. They still made comments that framed my presence as adjustable. And because I didn't challenge those assumptions, they grew more comfortable making them. That comfort worked in my favor. People rarely notice change when it doesn't inconvenience them. I continued participating in daily routines. Meals, conversations, small talk. Nothing that would register as withdrawal. But I stopped emotionally anchoring myself to the idea of permanence. That shift was subtle but profound. I no longer reacted to offhand remarks about money or space. Not because they didn't matter, but because I no longer needed them to change. I wasn't negotiating for a better position inside the system. I was exiting it on my own terms. There's a kind of calm that comes with that. Not relief, not detachment, just steadiness. The knowledge that you're no longer vulnerable to sudden decisions because you've already accepted the possibility of them. Looking back, this was the last period of normalcy. The quiet before consequences, not because I caused them, but because systems react when unseen supports begin to disengage. I didn't know exactly when things would shift. I only knew I wouldn't be unprepared when they did. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They crept in as confusion. At first, it was subtle enough that no one named it. Small delays, minor oversights. Things that used to resolve themselves suddenly lingered. A bill wasn't paid as early as usual. A document wasn't where someone expected it to be. A logistical detail slipped through the cracks. Nothing serious, nothing urgent, but enough to create friction. My parents began noticing the absence of something they had never consciously acknowledged before. My quiet buffering. The invisible work that smoothed transitions, anticipated needs, and absorbed uncertainty had slowed, not stopped, just slowed enough to be felt. They didn't connect it to a choice, they assumed it was a circumstance. I heard it in the way questions were asked. Did you already take care of this? I thought you usually handled that. There was no accusation in their voices, only surprise. As if gravity had briefly malfunctioned, I responded calmly, truthfully. I haven't gotten to it yet, or I wasn't aware that was my responsibility. Statements of fact, no edge, no explanation. Those responses unsettled them more than resistance ever could have. Because resistance invites argument, neutrality invites recalibration. I watched how quickly discomfort turned into subtle pressure. Not confrontation, never that, but implication. Reminders. Assumptions are repeated more firmly. The system was trying to correct itself. But I didn't rush to stabilize it. I wasn't withdrawing support out of spite. I was allowing natural consequences to surface. I was letting responsibilities return to the people who owned them. That shift created unease. Conversations about money became more frequent, less casual. There was a new urgency to them, a sense that something wasn't adding up the way it used to. Plans that relied on my flexibility began to feel heavier without it. Still, no one asked me directly what had changed, because asking would have required acknowledging that something had been taken for granted. Instead, they spoke around the issue. They framed their stress as external, temporary, manageable. They reassured themselves and me that everything was fine. But it wasn't. The system was straining. I could feel it in the pauses between sentences. In the way topics circled back repeatedly. In how often phrases like, "we'll figure it out," were used, now with a trace of uncertainty instead of confidence. And through it all, I remained steady, not cold, not distant, just no longer compensating. That was when I understood something important. My silence had always been part of the structure. Removing it didn't cause chaos, it revealed dependency. They weren't losing me yet. They were losing the ease my presence had provided. And ease, once gone, makes people anxious in ways they don't immediately understand. That anxiety would soon look for a cause. When the anxiety finally found a direction, it didn't look like accountability. It looked like urgency. Suddenly, conversations that had been vague for years became specific, but only on the surface. My parents began talking more often about money, about space, about how things were going to work moving forward. The tone wasn't collaborative, it was corrective, as if something had gone off track and needed to be brought back into alignment, back into their alignment. I could tell they felt it now, the loss of ease, the subtle instability that had crept into daily life. But instead of asking what had changed, they focused on restoring what had been lost without examining why it existed in the first place. That's when the panic started to show. Not loud panic, controlled panic, the kind that disguises itself as practicality. There were comments about tightening budgets, about needing clarity on contributions, about expectations being misunderstood. The language shifted in a way I recognized immediately. It was the language people use when they realize something important is slipping, but they don't want to admit they never secured it properly. They wanted to fix the outcome without revisiting the structure. I listened, I nodded, I didn't argue, because by then, it was already too late. Any attempt to fix things came from the assumption that my role was still available, that I would reinsert myself into the gaps if they were acknowledged just enough. That a few conversations, a few adjustments, could return the system to equilibrium. But I had already stepped out of that equation internally. When you've spent years being adaptable, people assume adaptation is infinite. They don't realize it's a finite resource, one that runs out quietly. Without warning, they began proposing solutions that relied on my continued flexibility, longer timelines, temporary measures, promises of future clarity. All the same tools that had sustained the imbalance before, only now they were being deployed under pressure. That's when I understood something else. Urgency doesn't create fairness. It reveals what people value when comfort disappears. And what they valued most was restoring normalcy, not redefining my place. There was a moment, brief but telling, when one of my parents said, "We just need things to go back to how they were." They didn't mean emotionally, they meant structurally. They meant the version of me that absorbed uncertainty, so they didn't have to feel it. I realized then that no amount of explanation would change the outcome. Because the problem, from their perspective, wasn't the system, it was the disruption of it. And I was the disruption now. Not because I had acted aggressively, not because I had demanded anything unreasonable, but because I had stopped being predictably available. By the time they sensed that something fundamental had shifted, there was no clean way to reverse it. Any attempt to negotiate now would have been framed as damage control, not mutual understanding. And das vom damage control never rebuilds trust. It only delays loss. That was the moment I knew that whatever happened next, whatever line was crossed, it wouldn't be the beginning of the end. It would be the end of the beginning. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a climax. It felt like closure arriving on schedule. There was no raised voice, no accusations, no dramatic declarations. Just a conversation that carried the weight of everything that had gone unsaid for years. It started with money, because that's always where people go when they want to talk about control without admitting it. The tone was careful, measured, almost rehearsed. They spoke about boundaries, expectations, and how things had become unclear. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, there was a pause. The kind that usually invites reassurance. Agreement. A return to normal. I didn't give them that. Instead, I spoke calmly, slowly, not emotionally, factually. I said that I understood their concerns, that I agreed clarity was important, and that I had already made arrangements to remove myself from the situation entirely. That was it. No justification, no recounting of past sacrifices, no attempt to make them see my perspective. I didn't need them to understand. I needed them to hear the outcome. The room changed immediately, not with anger, but with confusion. This wasn't the script they expected. They had prepared for negotiation, not finality. Questions followed. Where, when, why so sudden? I answered what was necessary and left the rest untouched. I didn't accuse them of anything. I didn't frame my decision as a reaction to their behavior. I framed it as a choice I had already made. Because once you present a decision as settled, people stop trying to manage your emotions and start recalculating reality. That's when it happened. One of them said carefully that maybe it would be better if I moved out sooner than planned, that it might reduce tension, that space could help. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my timeline. I simply agreed. And that agreement did something unexpected. It removed their leverage. They had assumed the idea of being pushed out would unsettle me, that it would force me to negotiate. Instead, it aligned perfectly with what I had already prepared for. Later that day, I went out to run an errand. Nothing dramatic, just a normal exit. When I came back, my key no longer worked. No warning, no message, just a locked door. My parents had decided, quietly, efficiently, that this was the cleanest way to end it. And standing there, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, relief, because the ambiguity was gone. The thing I had prepared for had arrived exactly as predicted. The system had resolved itself in the only way it could, by removing the element it could no longer rely on without question. I didn't knock, I didn't call, I didn't demand an explanation. I took a breath, turned away from the door, and walked to my car. That was the last time I stood outside a place that had already stopped being my home long before the lock changed. Who I am now is not a reaction to what happened. That's the most important distinction. For a long time after that locked door, people assumed I must be angry, bitter, or deeply wounded. They expected a rupture in my identity, as if losing access to a home automatically meant losing balance. It didn't, because by the time the door closed, I had already left emotionally. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a life that was quieter, leaner, and more deliberate. No borrowed space, no implied obligations, no assumptions I didn't agree to. Everything I had was clearly mine, earned, chosen, and protected. There was grief, yes, but it wasn't explosive. It was reflective. The kind of grief that comes from seeing something clearly for the first time and realizing it was never what you thought it was. I didn't cut my parents out of my life. I didn't demonize them. I simply redefined the terms under which I existed in relation to them. Limited contact, clear boundaries, no shared dependencies. And something surprising happened. I became lighter, not because I had won, but because I was no longer holding a structure together that required my silence to function. I no longer had to interpret tone, manage expectations, or anticipate needs that weren't mine to meet. I started trusting myself in a way I hadn't before. I trusted my discomfort. I trusted my observations. I trusted my ability to act without permission. The identity I had been given, reliable, adaptable, easy, didn't disappear. It transformed. Those traits didn't belong to my family. They belonged to me. And when I used them in environments that respected boundaries, they became strengths instead of liabilities. I stopped confusing calm with compliance. I stopped equating loyalty with endurance. I stopped believing that being useful was the same as being valued. Now, when I enter a space, professional or personal, I'm clear about my role. I don't overextend to prove my worth. I don't stay silent to preserve comfort. I ask questions early, not because I expect perfect answers, but because clarity is a form of self-respect. And if clarity makes someone uncomfortable, I pay attention, because comfort built on my invisibility is not something I'm willing to sustain anymore. I didn't need closure conversations. I didn't need apologies. What I needed was alignment between how I lived and what I understood to be true. I have that now, and that's how I know I didn't lose a home. I left a role. There's a version of this story that could have been louder, one where I argued earlier, one where I demanded recognition, one where the lock on the door came as a shocking betrayal instead of a quiet confirmation. That version might sound more dramatic, but it wouldn't be more honest. Because the truth is, nothing in this story happened all at once. It unfolded the way many family dynamics do, slowly, politely, and under the cover of good intentions. No one set out to hurt anyone. No one thought they were being unfair. But fairness doesn't require bad intentions to be absent. It requires responsibility to be shared. What I learned is this: when you are consistently the reasonable one, people stop checking whether what's being asked of you is reasonable at all. Silence, in that context, becomes dangerous. Not because it's weak, but because it teaches others that your limits are theoretical. I don't tell this story to encourage confrontation, and I don't tell it to promote walking away as the first solution. What I hope it offers is something quieter and more useful: permission to pay attention. Pay attention to patterns instead of promises. Pay attention to who benefits from ambiguity. Pay attention to whether your flexibility is being matched with protection. Because families, like any system, tend to preserve what works for them. And if your role is to absorb uncertainty, The system has no incentive to change until you do. Being locked out of that house was not the worst moment of my life. The worst part would have been staying years longer, believing I belonged somewhere that only worked as long as I stayed quiet. Losing access forced clarity, and clarity gave me something far more durable than a room or a roof. It gave me authorship over my own life. Today, I live in a space where expectations are spoken, contributions are mutual, and silence is a choice, not a requirement. I don't chase harmony by shrinking myself. I built it by being clear early and calm always. If there's one moral to take from this, it's not leave when things get hard. It's this: if your place depends on your silence, it was never secure to begin with. I'm curious to hear from you. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that staying quiet was costing you more than speaking up ever would? If this story resonated, share your thoughts in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.